Hello and good evening, everyone. We welcome you to this very first event of the Orient Black Swan discussion series. We are excited at the prospect of launching this interactive webinar series, where our goal is to engage you, our audience, with a rich variety of scholarly and public debates that are topical, lively, and informative. Our discussion series will feature sessions with two most prominent personalities and highly acclaimed scholars of international repute who will discuss a topic live, in conversation with each other, and take questions from the audience. We will also have panel discussions wherein 3 or 4 scholars will critically discuss and analyze books recently published by Orient Black Swan. Each webinar will consist of 45 minutes of discussion and 15 minutes of questions and answers. Our very first discussion begins on a philosophical note, addressing the predicament that we all currently find ourselves in, and the many existential questions and dilemmas that the pandemic has forced us collectively and individually to confront. We are delighted and honored to have with us today Mr. Ashok Vajpayee and Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. Mr. Ashok Vajpayee is a celebrated and well-loved Hindi poet, literary and cultural critic, art lover, and institution maker. With 17 books of poetry and 10 books of criticism in Hindi to his credit, he has also written extensively in English on the visual arts and Hindustani classical music. A recipient of the Sahitya Academy Award, he has also been decorated with high honors by both the French and Polish governments. His poetry has been translated into English, French, Polish, and several Indian languages. Ashok Vajpayee is Managing Trustee of the Raza Foundation in New Delhi, a cultural and artistic institution which aims to promote the works of the renowned Indian painter Syed Haider Raza. Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo is one of the world's leading political philosophers and most widely read authors. He has taught at institutions around the world, including the Academy of Philosophy in Tehran, University of Toronto, and Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. For his extensive work in promoting dialogue between cultures and his advocacy of nonviolence, he won the Peace Prize from the United Nations Association in Spain. He is also on the advisory board of PEN Canada. PEN, as you know, stands for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought within each nation and between all nations, and opposes any form of suppression of freedom of expression. He has 29 published books to his credit, which include Talking Philosophy, The Decline of Civilization, On Forgiveness and Revenge, The Disobedient Indian Gandhi's Philosophy of Resistance, and more recently, The Courage to Exist, A Philosophy of Life and Death in the Age of Coronavirus, published by Orient Black Swan. Ramin Jahanbegloo is Professor and Vice Dean, Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace, O.P. Jindal Global University, Sonipat, India. Thank you so much, Mr. Vajpayee and Professor Jahanbegloo, for joining us today. I now request Mr. Ashok Vajpayee and Professor Jahanbegloo to take the discussion forward.
Well, Ramin.
Yes, I can start if you like.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Nilanjana. It's first of all, I have to thank all the group of Orient Black Swan. This is a new friendship with them, but I hope, as Humphrey Bogart says in Casablanca, that it's going to be the beginning of a long friendship. And I'm very happy to have started with this new book, which is called The Courage to Exist. And it's going to be followed by 2 other books, actually, because it's a trilogy. And I have to say a few words about this book and the idea that we're going to discuss with Ashokji. Why? I mean, it has to do with COVID-19, of course. The 3 books have been written during the confinement that I had in India, which is something like 6 months a period. Now I'm talking to you from Toronto, where my family lives and where I live part of the year, but I'm going to be back in India again. Well, I think that the COVID-19 actually what it taught us around the globe is had to do is kind of a reality check, I would say, on our biological and ontological fragility. And this is what I discuss in the book mainly. We realized once again that despite our modern techno-scientific achievements, human existence on this planet is inherently fragile. Secondly, I think that the confrontation with coronavirus reminded us of the fact that even if we are too obsessed, when we are too obsessed with success, we usually forget how to live. And this is the subject that I discuss, actually, the art of living and art of dying in this book, is that today's world, I think in today's world, human beings take living and dying for given and for granted mostly, and not as a task of the mind. And actually, I believe that the task of living is not to be necessarily successful or to be a celebrity or to become a celebrity, as we see in the world today, but to live in peace with ourselves and with the world. As for the task of dying, it is to bridge the abyss, I think, between being and non-being. And as such, I think that the care for existence, the courage for existence, is kind of a care for death also at the same time. Even though death is the end, I think it depends a lot on life, which is the beginning. As we say in Latin, finis origine pendet, which means the end depends upon the beginning. Now, Plato actually told us that the beginning is like a god, which as long as it dwells among men, saves all things. But I'm not sure that for a long time we know that gods are not dwelling among us anymore, and we're all alone by ourselves on this earth. So we are left without the art of living and without the art of dying. But if we don't know any more how to live and how to die, could we be able to think and to act in a meaningful way? That's the question that I ask in this book. And what is left to us, actually? How can we live? How can we die? And what we can do? Now, to be very short, because I want to engage in discussion with Ashokji, I think that we can have, actually, if we are looking at what I call our new dark times, I can say that there are 4 points, 4 general universal points which come out when we look at our world, and especially after the experience of COVID-19, which is still with us and going on. First of all, the problem, as I said, the problem of fragility is there, of course, but this problem is very closely related to the problem of truth-seeking and to the problem of passion for democracy and for freedom. Because as we see, we need to fight for democracy more and more, which has a monopoly on evil. And this is very important, actually, that we link our human freedom to our fragility as human beings. So as a citizen, we need to be responsible and we need to have these democratic passions. Secondly, is the point that I talk about in the book, which is question of solidarity. Solidarity in the shape of everything and in the shape of sharing and having a common humanity and empathy for the other. The consequences of COVID-19 is going to be terrible economically for poverty, poor people, migrations. So empathy is one of the values which has to come back, and I've been working on that for a long period of time. And it's important. And lastly, but not least, I would say nonviolence, which has always been in my mind and is a very important strategy that we need to have in our everyday life. We're going to have a rise of violence around the world more and more, not only in the regional and international wars, but in the societies that we can see today in the United States of America. So we have to, by giving meaning to our art of living and art of dying, we are actually giving more meaning, not only to our empathetic values, but also to the taming of violence in our societies. So I think I'm going to stop here and leave the floor to Ashokji.
No, Ramin, one of the things that struck me reading your book, at one point you say that the book of life is best read in solitude. Of
Yes,
course, is we at the moment have been forced into a kind of a solitude uh, by the pandemic and the resultant lockdown or whatever. So there is a social isolation, and everybody seems to be a danger to everybody else. Now, this is a very new situation where, uh, as you rightly emphasize, that empathy has to intervene. Unfortunately, what is intervening is not so much empathy, at least in the state or in the ruling regimes. What is resulting is a kind of a exploiting this isolation to create stricter and unfree regimes of laws and things of that kind. So it creates a strange contradiction in our time. On the one hand, we have the opportunity as individuals to think with some degree of meditative and maybe ethical urgency, uh, like you have done in this wonderful book. But on the other hand, we are faced not only with the isolation, but we also faced by the recurring violence, and to sort of, in a way, negotiate between the two becomes difficult. Difficult. You have talked of wisdom right in the beginning of the book. Now, how does one attain this wisdom in these very troubled and trying times? Is it, how can you, you have talked also of the solidarity of the shaken,
yes,
the Czech philosopher's concept of solidarity. Now, solidarity in these times becomes uh, somehow uh, not so physically possible. It can only be spiritually or ethically possible, but not physically, because physically that solidarity itself can be attacked and can face violence or negation or whatever. So I would think that it's a very difficult situation where all kinds of contradictions have come in sharp focus. Isolation, and on the one hand, but social distrust on the other hand, opportunities for reflection, but also opportunity for curbing reflection. You have talked about that dissidence is a creative process. Now, in many countries, including India, dissidence is being suppressed and is being looked upon as if it is a violation. But you have also talked about the fact that democracy seemed to be moving towards assertion of rights rather than realization of some responsibilities. So the whole spectrum that you have covered is so wide that to discuss it in few generalizations is perhaps not very fair. But still, amongst all this, the wisdom that you are insisting upon, I think, consists of search for truth and this respect for the otherness of the other. And the third point, as far as I can make out, is non-violence, that all this should be done. Now, would you like to say something more about the contours of wisdom that you think are desirable, but which do not seem to be evident in the social and political milieu that the world is finding itself. Nami.
Yes, thank you very much, Ashokji. Actually, when I talk about wisdom, I go back to Socrates and to the idea of examined life. I mean, one of the points that I'm making, and not only in this book, but in many other books that I've been writing for the past 10 years, is that we do not examine our lives anymore in today's world. This has to do with several factors that you actually touched. One of them being that modern man is suffering from a double alienation. On the one hand, modern man is completely alien to the natural world. And on the other hand, modern man has become a stranger to the logic of life. So, the Cartesian project, which was put by Descartes, the French philosopher, that we have to become masters and possessors of nature, actually it has taken shape through our techno-scientific positivism and our utilitarian and consumer way of looking at life. Therefore, even in the worst of the I would say of the worlds where we are confronted with a pandemic, and we know that we are in fragile and humanity is endangered. Again, this fear this fear which has become very universal, this fear, because we are living an age of fear actually, this fear does not take us to a form of wisdom. It is actually taking us to a more authoritarian ways of governing citizens, as we can see around the world, because the political managers, the corporate world, like Amazon and others, they are taking advantage of the suffering of others to become more rich. And the gap between the poor and the rich is getting wider and wider. So these are all the problems that exist. And one other problem that you touch, which is important, is the problem of solitude. Solitude per se is not a bad thing. You as a poet, you need your solitude to be creative. An artist needs that. A philosopher like me needs that. And anybody, simple people also need sometimes to have their solitude. But solitude is different from forced confinement. I've been a political prisoner in solitary confinement, and I know that I cannot define solitary confinement as a form of solitude. Is a forced confinement, like the lockdowns that we had, which were not chosen by the citizens, it were chosen by the governments, including in India or elsewhere. They still go on somehow, because people do not have the time to reflect on it. This is the whole problem that I'm saying. We do not have any more time to reflect on our experience of life and our experience of death. So this becomes a huge problem, that how are we going to look at our problems? Like, for example, I think the COVID-19 pandemic is teaching us that we're going to have huge problems, huge crises regarding the climate change, regarding the planet Earth. And if we do not take our responsibilities as soon as possible, we're going to lose a lot of things. And I think that it has to do with the fact that our experience of life and death, in the same way as we look at nature, has lost its sense of sacredness, including in India, which is, I always repeat that India is one of the last reservoirs of spirituality in the world. But if it becomes a Bollywoodian, spirituality, becomes nonsense, because sense of sacredness, including in the family, in friendship, in love, in all our manners of living and dying, including death, it's for thousands of years gave sense to civilizations and to human beings and to art and to philosophy and to religion, the three main pillars of human civilization. Now, these three pillars of human civilization are very, very fragile, and actually some of them are non-existent anymore, because we are practicing them no more by conviction, only by distraction. And there is a difference between conviction and distraction. You know, the problems that you were touching, actually including the problem of wisdom, as I said, for examined life, is not a question of distraction, it's a question of moral conviction. And this is what differentiates today's politicians in India and elsewhere from somebody like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, because they were people who were convinced. They were moral leaders, first of all, and not only political leaders. And secondly, they were convinced about the sacredness of life and the sacredness of death, and they gave sense to what they did and to this to the freedom and to the otherness of the other, which is one of the notions that I use a lot in my works. Actually, otherness of the other. What is the otherness of the other? Actually, otherness of the other is the treeness of the tree, the frogness of the frog, is the humanness of human, is the Indianness of the Indian. So instead of looking at people in the way we want, you know, in the way the politicians want, we have to look at the essence of things, you know, before destroying them. I'm not sure that we have this capacity anymore that poets usually have. And for long time, I think that human beings had, is to look at nature in the way it is, and not only as a utility for our own lives. You know, that's how we have become consumers, and we have no more this self-reflective awareness about life and death.
Yes. Well, you touch upon the loss of the sacred. In fact, the
Yeah.
disappearance of the sacred from our lives, and particularly with respect to nature. You know, I was born and brought up, uh, and I was a non-believer. But when I got married, uh, my mother made me go to a well with my wife to offer, flowers to the well, then to a big tree, as well as
Mm-hmm.
to the temple. Now, there was a kind of a expression of gratitude to nature at what it does. In fact, one of the two points that you have covered in the book, one is about how the birds have perfected the art of the dawn, in a manner of
Yes.
speech, and the other is about the tree. Now, all these have now disappeared from our moral imagination. And the disappearance from the moral imagination has caused a serious loss. Nothing is sacred now except ritualistically, once in a while, because nothing is considered to be inviolate. And this notion that the Homo sapiens have a endless, interminable right to violate anything seems to be in its worst manifestations available to us now. But you also talk about civic friendship and compassionate fellowship. Now, in India, during the first phase of lockdown, millions and millions of migrants returned home and to their villages. They were cared for by the more enlightened and more generous sections of the society. But the state as a whole failed them, betrayed them, did not provide the wherewithals to reach home, nor the wherewithals to stay where they were. And this is one of the largest migration that has ever taken place. And it did arouse empathy and sort of uh, care from groups, from groups of people, but not from the state. Now, this is a strange thing happening. The state which represents the people is devoid of empathy, although the people still have it. The state which is elected to power by the people, they still want what you call this compassionate fellowship or civic friendship, but the state acts contrary to that. So it's a I don't know how this this binary is going to be uh, superseded, uh,
Mm.
except perhaps by individual action. Now, but there are limits to individual action, of course. One can live and die, as you say, with meaning and dignity. But one is one, whereas the problems are of many. So, how do we negotiate this terrain which has become so messy, so chaotic, and so inhuman in many ways? Yes.
Yes, you touched upon many concepts actually, which are key concepts, and I actually been using them. In most of the books that I write, as in my teaching and in the life that I have had as a philosopher, I try to learn a lot from my classics. I always write and think with my classics, meaning classical philosophers, classical writers, classical poets, artists,
Yeah.
um, people who in the past, I would say, 3,000 years, if not 5,000 years since Sumer civilization, they have tried to explain life and death and the human society. So I think we need to go back and read our classics. Actually, one thing that we don't do, my students are very ignorant people, I mean, because they are not interested at all in learning. They are mostly interested, I'm not generalizing, some of them are, but they are interested in getting grades and having jobs. This was not actually the task of human beings in many different societies. Adolescents and young people were supposed to learn the art of living and art of dying and art of sharing with others. Now, you touched upon two concepts which I use, which are not actually mine. Civic friendship is a concept which is used by Aristotle. And I think it's a very strong concept for today's world, where we have mismanagement, political mismanagement, economic mismanagement, and especially lack of humility in many, many different countries, even countries which declare to be liberal democracies like India. This lack of humility, when you talk about dignity, this sense of nobility and dignity that human beings should have in regard to themselves as human beings, they need to share it with the natural world, which is not the case. We do not have this epistemic humility, and we do not have this existential humility in regard to other living organisms. Uh, I have seen many times around the world on the streets, including in Delhi and in Mumbai, where you have a lot of street dogs, and very few people feed these street dogs, but many people actually take a stone and throw them a stone, or take a stick and run after these dogs. I mean, these dogs are sharing the environment with us. Why should we not be humble and share our environment with them? We are not sharing it at all. We destroy, if people have big gardens and they want to turn it into apartments, they will cut 100 or 200 years trees, because they are thinking in terms of money and utility more than thinking in terms of having this tree and living in this tree. You know, their grandparents have been living with this tree, and great grandparents have been living with this tree. So the tree is actually sharing part of the memory of that family. But these are things which have not become any more important. Now, it has to do with the fact that I think again, life has become very meaningless for us, and it has become meaningless because we try to formulate it through our education as only success and the value of success, and saying life is about success. I grow up, I get an education, but my education is to make of me a corporate lawyer, is to make of me a businessman, and that's the only thing which counts in life. But actually, it does not count, because when you turn 70 or 80 and you look back, you have not lived at all. I mean, the people who have this kind of logic, they have not lived. And it has to do with the fact that life has been purposeless in this sense, and it has been secretless. I think the whole thing which is so interesting about poets like you, or philosophers or artists, is that they are searching for the secret of life. You know, the life has a secret for them, and it's very, very important. It's not only success, or let's say with the case of pandemic, a single wretched and suffering of human beings around the globe. Is much more than that. I think it has to do with the fact that we need to understand that the purpose of life is life itself. But how can we approach this? Once again, this wisdom that we need, and we need to have a more examined way of looking at life, which is and death as an experience. So I think that we need to underline all these elements which are so important in our everyday life, as social life, political life, and natural life.
Well, Ramin, taking the cue from what you said about success, we bring out a journal from the Reza Foundation in English called Arup. It's in English, but the title is in.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yes, you have seen them. And we have brought out a number now, which is on failure.
Yes.
Now, in a success blind world, one has to sort of assert that some of the most noble achievements of humanity have been through failure, not through success. But the other thing that you have raised in the book is about resisting. And you start by resisting mediocrity.
Mm-hmm.
But mediocrity, success, and resistance, how do you connect them in a manner in which resistance becomes what you call a creative process, unconcerned with success? Because you are a great admirer of Gandhi, and you know some of his greatest uh, ideas in the normal sense of the term failed. They did not
Mm-hmm.
succeed.
Yes.
And yet uh, he was able to create a, out of resistance, a kind of a creative process. Second point that I want to raise is it possible for individuals or normal human beings to indulge in some kind of a non-cooperation? You know, in in your book on Gandhi, The Disobedient Indian, you have delineated this, that non-cooperation with evil, with violence, with corruption, with ritualism, non-cooperation with that which destroys the sacredness of life, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, which also destroys nature and other forms of being. a non-cooperation. Such movements have taken place in India, in hills, for instance, when they once had non-cooperation and they against cutting of trees. And the Adivasis sometimes in Chhattisgarh and other areas have also been resisting and by non-cooperating with the removal of minerals and removal of forests, which they consider to be sacred. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're touching very important points that have been in my mind for a long time, and I actually this is only one book where I'm touching on it. But the two following books, which are also getting published in the next few months by Orient Black Swan, one is called In Pursuit of Unhappiness, and the other one is called Pedagogy of Dissent. They deal with what, I mean, they try to answer the questions that you have been putting to me, actually. Well, first of all, I think that I try to, in different sections of this book, The Courage to Exist, I try to show that life is not, human life is not only suffering, but as you said, is also resisting, is also fighting, struggling. Human beings are creatures who fight and struggle for their freedom, because freedom has a sense for them, because they have the capacity of speech and action. But what do I mean by resistance? Actually, resistance, I do not mean necessarily violence, and I do not mean self-defense. I mean mostly dissidence and dissent. You know, the capacity of saying no and the capacity of fighting the evil. Now, that's a very important point for, which has been an important point for spiritual, I would say, thinkers. It has been for mystics, for poets, for philosophers. You know, for 1,000 years, they have been thinking about what is the evil? Can we talk about the evil or not? And I think that there is no universality of the evil. I mean, because each culture and each civilization touches on evil and experiments evil in a different manner, you know, and we can see it from their processions and from their religious processions and from their religious culture. But the question that I'm asking is a question which is asked by Saint Augustine. You know, I try to find the source of the evil, and I got nowhere. Now, this is a huge question for humanity. We try to find the source of evil, and we got nowhere, because we're still producing the evil. You know, one of the flatteries of self-flattery of the today's civilization, 21st century, is that we are not religious anymore. We have technology, we have science, we can save human beings, even we can become immortal and eternal maybe in 50 years or 100 years from now. But we are producing another form of evil, you know? I mean, we can see it. Even this pandemic is somehow is no more natural in the same way that you have the plague in the Middle Ages, or you had the Justinian plague that I talk about in the book.
Yeah.
It's a very modern phenomenon. So we have to understand that. So resistance is important, but resistance in the form of dissent, which means to stand up and say what you have to say. And this is where disobedience becomes important, because to disobey unjust laws, as Gandhi, for example, say, somebody like Gandhi, is that you have a sense of the law. You have a sense of civicness, you have a civility, you have a sense of civilization. You understand why we make laws. We do not make laws because we want people to be in power. We do not have constitutions in order to have political parties to be in power. We make constitutions and we make laws to learn how to be free and to live as free human beings. So we need to resist and to disobey anything. We have actually a moral obligation to disobey. This is the title of one of my other books, Moral Obligation to Disobey. Why? Because this moral obligation to disobey is like the moral obligation to fight against tyranny. It's like it's a moral obligation to save the earth. Uh, we have responsibilities, and unfortunately, the idea of responsibility has becoming less and less universal, and more people are talking about, well, we have to see what are our advantages, what are our
Right, sir.
profits, benefits, and then we can talk about our responsibilities. But I think, like Gandhi said, duties come before rights, or they come next to rights. Even if we talk about our individual rights, which are very important, we should not never forget about our duties as citizens and as human beings.
Uh, one other last point. You say that life is rooted in hope, responsibility, and truth. There's a
Yes,
trinity you have created of responsibility, hope, and truth. Now, how do you manage to have a life of that kind in, in the face of all that we are confronted with in our daily life, during the pandemic, or even before that? It's a it's a question which an individual can decide if he has a moral vision, but can communities and societies decide to have a life of hope, responsibility, and truth?
absolutely. Absolutely, because the individual doesn't have make sense without the community, because we are living as human beings and we are part of a humanity. As a thinker like Hannah Arendt says, when we are born into a humanity. Actually, there have been millions of, thousands of years, people living before us and dying, and we enter a civilization, we enter a culture, we enter a tradition. So we have two. Let's take, for example, being an Indian. I'm a very intercultural person. So I actually I'm divided between several ontologies and several ways of living. Because I was born in Iran, I lived in France as a European, and then I've been traveling to 40 countries, living in 7 countries, and now I'm between North America and India. So, when I live in India, I think that I share a lot of things which are Indian, uh, because I feel responsible towards India. I feel responsible because I'm a teacher, I'm an instructor, I'm a professor. I have to teach young Indians, so I feel responsible. I try to learn from them. I try to learn from my friends like you and others. I did 10 books with the eminent in Indian intellectuals, because I wanted to learn from them. The sociologists, philosophers, psychologists, poets like you, artists, civic actors, uh, because I thought that it's important to learn. So that, I think, is very, very important. But in a universal term, and not only individual term, what is very important is, again, the question of responsible citizenry as global citizens. Especially, I think the COVID-19 is teaching us that we need to have a responsible citizenry in a world where democratic passion is in decline, and populism is rising, actually. So we're going to be confronted with a monopoly of evil. I would call it a monopoly of evil in politics. And we have to be very careful, if we do not have this self-reflection about what kind of citizen we are and why do we live with others, and how we should fight this monopoly of evil. I think that we're gonna destroy ourselves. So the most important is to have that, but we could not have it without truth seeking and fighting against lie. You know, this is actually the most important lesson that I learned from somebody who I met several times, which was Václav Havel. He was one of the persons who during his life and resistance in communist countries. He talked about uh, living in truth, in the same way that Gandhi and Martin Luther King and many others talked about living in truth. Living in truth is one of the most important tasks that we have today, as human beings, as citizens, as philosophers, as poets, as artists, as intellectuals, but also, I would say, as lawyers and many other things. Living in truth, and not to co-opt with lies that is given to us on a daily basis. So these are actually this is the point where we're staying, and this is where the point that these are the responsibilities and duties that we have for a better future.
Now I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor Jahabeglu and Dr. Vajpayee for such a thought-provoking. We've received an overwhelming number of questions both on Zoom and YouTube. So I will put them forward to you, and then either of you can take them. The first question comes from an anonymous attendee. They ask, how do you see dissent in the context of what Ferguson says, anti-political machine that the public has become?
Yes.
Should I answer one by one?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Should I put forward more?
I think it would be good to take maybe 2 or 3 questions so we can answer those. Yes.
Right. So the second question comes from Professor Yelesh Lanjavar. Humans are going against nature. Do you agree? If yes, should every virological research be registered for responsibility? The third question also comes from an anonymous attendee. They ask, did your fight for democratic institutions get a boost after your Iranian imprisonment? And second, as a philosopher, how do you see the link between Vedanta and democracy? This question is for Professor Jahabeglu.
Yeah, Ramin.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, these are big questions, and I try to answer very shortly, and you know, and they're very related, actually. You know, if I went to prison in Iran, it was because of my my belief in nonviolence, mostly. I've never worked with any political party at any moment. I prefer to be a militant. When I was a student, I was a militant of human rights in France, and also for nonviolence with the French nonviolent groups, for the good reason that I always believed in dissent, of course, as a form of responsibility and global responsibility towards what's going on in the world, because I think that lack of freedom, in the same way as democracy, is they are very interrelated, you know, in around the world. I mean, if we can gain freedom in different parts of the world, they can influence, you know, countries and cultures where we don't have freedom. I think the experience of the Gandhian experience in India, the experience of Martin Luther King in America, in the United States of America, and Mandela in South Africa, in the past 70 years, these 3 have been very important and very inspiring for people who have been fighting, especially with nonviolence, with nonviolent resolution against dictatorships, against tyrannies. So this is very important, to look at the experience of others and learn from them. And I started learning from them and writing and working and teaching on them. But the everyday experience of dissent is an everyday experience. It's because it's like an examination of life, the moral examination of oneself, which is a daily basis, you know, because you put questions to yourself as you put questions to your government and to your culture. If there are points which are wrong in your culture, like Indian culture, there are points which are wrong, which are unjust. You have to put this question to your culture, but you have to put questions to your governments and to your political regimes. Now, many regimes, including liberal regimes, quote unquote liberal regimes around the world, they are questionable and they have to be accountable. So dissent is actually a way of making our governments dissent accountable, I would say, responsible, accountable. And if they don't want to be accountable, we continue our struggle and our resistance and our dissent. And the only way of doing it is also through education. We didn't touch the matter of education, which is so important for me. That's why the third book with Orient Black Swan is called Pedagogy of Dissent. Dissent is a form of pedagogy, and it has always been like that. I mean, you have to teach the future generation to be free men, to be free human beings, to learn to question. I think the art of questioning is something that we are losing because we have lost the art of questioning the questions. And the questions which are put to us are not true questions. And the whole point that I have is that now that we're living a global tragedy called COVID-19, coronavirus crisis, we have to put to ourselves the true questions and global questions, and not very small questions, which has to go back. The question of responsibility and accountability are global questions. Maybe Ashoka has something to say on this.
No, I just wanted to say that when some of us returned our awards against growing intolerance in India, somebody asked me that this dissent and etc. is a recent phenomenon. And I said, no, it is not. Dissent is as much a part of our tradition as affirmation or celebration, what you have. So I, in fact, edited an anthology which consists of more than 500 pages, which traces dissent in Indian tradition, both in terms of state, in terms of faith, in terms of philosophy, in terms of belief, from the Vedic times to the modern times. So this notion that dissent is a gift of democracy is not true. Dissent has been there, at least in Indian tradition, for a very, very long time. For 5,000 years, if you like, that civilizational life of India. And therefore, to be dissenting is to be in Indian tradition. Whether politically it is suitable or not, but spiritually it is perfectly authentic. Yes.
Thank you. The next question is from Professor Yasmin Arif. I appreciate the idea of global citizenship. How do we reconcile identity in politics, which is often seen as a moral assertion or right in claiming citizenship? Seems like an unlikely way to move towards global empathy.
Any more?
Yes. This is a question in 3 parts. The next one. It comes from Professor Prashantare. Whose courage do we have in mind here? Don't we survive even when we are afraid? Isn't being afraid rather than courageous sometimes a better tactic of negotiating a crisis in terms of sheer survival? And would courage alone suffice when the entire medicine industry and the state are busy projecting the ferocity of the pandemic so that we fall helpless at their feet?
Okay.
Yes, I mean.
Should we go? Okay. I think this is the last round because we have to finish in 5 minutes, I think. About global citizenship, I think that we have 2 forms of citizenship. We are citizens of the world as human beings. So we have a sense of our duty and responsibility, which goes beyond our national cultures or religious cultures, beyond our traditions. That's why more we learn about other cultures, more we have this sense of being human, fully human beings. So this global citizenship is a very important. So we see it with COVID-19 actually, that the sense of you have a sense of empathy, you have a sense of pity, you have a sense of charity for people who are dying of COVID-19 in Italy, in Spain, or not only in India but also in United States of America or in the Middle East, because we have a shared suffering. So this is, I think, global citizenship has to do with the shared values, with what we can call a common humanity, or what has been called a common humanity. This sense of common humanity is a very important moral imperative, I think, in our lives. And next to it, of course, we have the question of identities, and which is linked our politics and political action in everyday life is somehow based on it or linked to it. But there is a big problem, and we see it in populism or in populist actions. And that's the fact that identity actually the politics of identity might turn against democracy and against our freedoms. We have to be very careful that it doesn't, when we're talking about our identity, cultural identity, it does not become a fanaticism, and it does not become fanatic and dogmatic. So on the one hand, I mean, I think the best explanation would be again Gandhi when he says, I like to keep my house and the windows of my house open to other cultures, but I don't want any other culture to take off the roof of my house, which he meant by colonialism or imperialism, of course. And this is the best, I think, the feature that we can have as responsible citizens. Be open to others, but also have a consciousness about your own culture at the same time. Be like Ashok Vajpayee, a Hindi poet, but also practice and write in English, write your poetry in English, and read French poets or German poets, as if you can share with them some kind of universality. So this, if we have, and this brings me to the second question, which is the question of fear. If we have fear, a fear of the other, there is no way that we can approach the otherness of the other with fear. In the same way, there is no way that you can approach an animal or a plant or any living organism or life in per se if you have fear of life. You will not have this sense of living if you are fearful about life itself. And and so I think that fear has always been a very negative point. It never helps. I don't believe that sense of examination is different from an observation is different from fear. It's based on our curiosity, but it's also based on humility. I don't think that fear can give us humility, and we need a lot of humility in today's world. Maybe Ashok has something to say on this.
No, I entirely agree with you. I think, again, go back to Gandhi, and one of the concepts that he championed and almost embodied in his own self was a fearlessness before a tyrannical colonial power. And that fearlessness lasted unto his last. So fear can never be uh, creative. It can never be positive. It can never help. But you cannot teach anybody to be fearless except
Yes.
by your own example, maybe. And if others are taking you to be an example. Gandhi had this advantage that he was an example to the whole world, but we are much lesser human beings. We cannot be an example to others. But fearlessness, and this is one of the another elements which he picked up from Indian tradition. Indian tradition, time and again, has been a tradition which asserts nirbhayata, fearlessness, that whether before God, before nature, before life, before anything, before reality, before tyranny, before state, before faith, before religion, you should be fearless. And that, I think, is a something which you can cultivate yourself, getting inspiration and assurances from your own tradition.
Absolutely. I think love and friendship are two modes of transcending fear.
Yes.
In my last word.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Jahan Beglu and Dr. Vajpayee. We have received many more such questions, and if it's okay with you both, maybe please email them to you so that you can go through them. So I will now pass this on to my colleague Moina for the closing remarks.
Dr. Vajpayee and Professor Jahan Beglu, thank you so much for that very insightful, enriching, philosophical, and deeply thought-provoking discussion. I know that we have probably raised more questions than we've been able to answer, but and I'm sorry that we were not able to address all of them at this session, but as Insia said that you can write them over email and we will address them to the participants. I thank each and every one of my colleagues at Orient Black Swan who've been involved in today's event, and to all members of the audience who have joined us today, who have written in with your questions, and to those of you watching us live on YouTube, a very big thank you. We do hope you have enjoyed today's discussion. We will be hosting such discussions at regular intervals from now on, regardless of pandemics and lockdowns, so do please look out for them. Thank you all once again for joining us. Wish you all a pleasant evening. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.